On March 3, 2011, a 911 call from the isolated forests surrounding Maplewood sent local authorities into a frenzy. Daniel Carter, a 34-year-old local with a history of alcohol abuse, phoned in a chilling confession. He had just killed his girlfriend, Sheila Raines, and insisted he was responsible for the deaths of 5 others, strangers he claimed he'd never met. When officers reached the scene, they found Carter alone in the forest, standing next to Sheila's lifeless body, clutching her phone. He surrendered without resistance, repeatedly asserting that the phone held evidence of his crimes. Here is Daniel's account of why he killed Sheila Raines.
I'm an alcoholic. My first drink was a beer my father shared with me when I was 11. By the time I could legally drink, I was having a couple every night. First because college was stressful, then because work was. But it wasn't until my wife left me that I started drinking without any limit or care. Alcohol wasn't my only way to cope after the divorce. I was addicted to one-night stands, barely bothering to learn a name before stumbling into someone's apartment or back to mine, always completely sloshed. My friends warned me, worried, but I couldn't stop. Losing her shattered me, and this was the only way I knew to get by. The first time it happened, I thought I'd reached rock bottom. After a night out, I woke up outside, sprawled in an alley behind some restaurant with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My whole body ached, my arms were scratched, and I thought, maybe, the woman I'd been with had gotten rough. I felt sick and grateful no one found me like that. It was humiliating enough to live with the memory. I swore I'd do better. For a few days I didn't go out with anyone, but I couldn't resist the bar. Eventually, I fell back into the old routine. After my next hookup, I woke up near the train station. My clothes were dirty, with dark stains that reeked of something foul, and dirt was packed under my fingernails. I couldn't remember how I got there, but I didn't think too much of it. I threw the clothes away, chalking it up to another sloppy night, and told myself not to let it happen again. For a while, I tried to pull myself together. I started going to therapy, cut back on drinking, and even managed a few sober nights here and there. It wasn't easy, but I felt like I was finally starting to dig myself out of the mess I'd been living in. My therapist said I was making progress, and even my friends started to believe I might be getting back to normal. It was around then that I got the call. My grandfather, a man I'd barely spoken to since I was a kid, was on his deathbed. The last time we'd talked was years ago, and we'd never been close. Yet now, out of nowhere, he wanted to see me. They said he was calling for me specifically, that it was his last wish to see his grandson before he died. I didn't understand it, but something about that call stuck with me. Maybe I thought I owed it to him, or maybe I was just curious, but I drove down to the hospital. When I got there, he looked almost unrecognizable, just skin and bones, barely hanging on. He opened his eyes, and there was this strange look in them, like he saw something beyond the room, something that didn't belong in this world. He whispered my name, and I leaned in to hear him. Suddenly, his hand shot out and grabbed my arm, gripping me so tightly it hurt. He stared into my eyes, and for a moment I felt this wave of something. It wasn't just the fear of watching someone die. It was like a dark current ran through him, passing into me. My whole body tensed, and then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, a nurse standing over me, calling my name. I could see my grandfather's still body lying on the bed, his hand still reaching out, his eyes fixed in that same strange, vacant stare. The doctor said I'd fainted, probably from grief, but I didn't feel grief. I felt different, like a shadow had wrapped itself around me. The nurses and doctors quickly ushered me out, giving me sympathetic looks. They'd seen it all before, they said, just a reaction to the stress. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now. After that night at the hospital, something in me changed. I tried to keep it together, but the dark pull I felt wouldn't let go. Slowly, I slipped back into my old ways. The bars, the hookups, the bottles lined up like an old habit I couldn't break. Each night I told myself it would be the last, that I'd get back on track tomorrow, but tomorrow never came. Then I met Sheila. She was edgy, a little reckless, and she had her own way of escaping the world through drugs and bad decisions. But unlike anyone I'd been with before, she showed me real kindness. She listened. She cared in ways I hadn't felt since my wife left. She wasn't like the others, the ones who drifted in and out of my life, cash in hand for favors. Sheila stayed. She didn't care about my drinking. Maybe she thought she could help me, or maybe she just liked the train wreck I was. Who knows? I let my guard down with her, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like maybe I could finally crawl out of the hole I'd dug myself into. But that's when the blackouts started again, worse than ever. It was like each night, As soon as I closed my eyes, I lost control, like I was slipping away. I'd wake up in strange places. A rundown park, an empty lot on the edge of town, once even in an abandoned building with broken windows letting in the dawn. I couldn't remember how I got there or what I'd done, just a foggy darkness that seemed to consume everything. Then the flashbacks started. They came slowly at first. Flashes of faces I didn't recognize, blurry and fleeting. But then, like pieces of a twisted puzzle snapping into place, they started coming in sharper, more brutal detail. One morning, I woke up drenched in sweat, clutching the edge of the bed as an image burned itself into my mind. I was standing over a man in a narrow alleyway, his eyes wide with terror, hands raised in front of his face. I watched as my own fist came down, felt the sickening crunch of bone against skin. Blood sprayed, spattering my clothes, warm and sticky, coating my hands. The look in his eyes, pleading, horrified, haunted me long after I blinked awake. But when I checked on my clothes, they didn't have any blood. Another morning, the flash was worse. I saw myself in an abandoned lot, the cold moonlight casting long shadows as I dragged a woman across gravel. Her scream echoed in my head, cut short as my hands closed around her throat. I could feel her pulse weakening under my grip, my fingers pressing deeper as her eyes rolled back. When her body went limp, I remember laughing, a low, hollow sound that didn't feel like mine. My hands were covered in blood, and I wiped them absently on my clothes, feeling nothing but an eerie satisfaction as I looked down at her lifeless face. But the worst one came next, so vivid it made me double over, clutching my stomach. In this vision, I was inside an old, darkened house. My hands were wrapped around a knife, its blade glistening, and I was moving closer to a man backed against the wall, his mouth open in a silent scream. I could see every vein on his neck, every twitch of his muscles as he struggled, helpless and cornered. I plunged the knife into his chest, felt the resistance of his flesh, the way his skin tore as I twisted it over and over, his blood gushing warm over my hands, pooling around my shoes. His face went slack, but I kept going like I couldn't stop. Something in me needed to see it through to the very end. Every time I woke, I could still feel the heat of the blood on my skin, the tremble in my fingers from the force I'd used. It wasn't just a vision, it felt real, like I was there, living it. And every time I'd wake up with this overwhelming certainty, these weren't just dreams. Somewhere people were dead, and I had been there, watching the life drain from their eyes. One night I awoke with a start, blinking into the pitch darkness of a forest I didn't recognize. The air was thick with silence, save for the rustling of branches in the night wind. I felt a chill run down my spine, instinctively knowing this wasn't where I had fallen asleep. But before panic could fully take hold, I saw her, a shadowy figure just a few paces away. "Sheila?" I whispered, my voice hoarse with disbelief. She stepped forward, her face coming into view under a thin sliver of moonlight, her lips curled into a sly, mischievous smile. "Oh, I was just following you, Danny," she said in a taunting voice. "Same way I've been doing every night you sleepwalk." I felt a sick dread pooling in my stomach, my mouth going dry. I stammered, barely able to comprehend her words. She took a step closer, her eyes gleaming with a strange amusement. "Following you?" She laughed softly, mockingly. "Recording you." She held up her phone, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. "I have videos of you, Danny. Every single night." Her voice dripped with a kind of playful malice, and then she added, almost purring, "I was thinking maybe it's time people know what you really get up to." And then she giggled. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I pictured it, those videos showing me, in places I could barely remember, doing things I could never undo. The flashbacks of bloodied faces, of bodies going limp under my grip, surged through me, each one sharper, more horrifying. "Give it to me," I croaked, reaching for her phone, but she jerked it away, laughing, delighted by the horror in my eyes. "What's wrong, Danny?" she whispered, feigning innocence. "Scared people might see who you really are?" A switch flipped in my head. My hand shot out faster than I realized, clamping around her throat. Her laughter turned to a strangled gasp, her eyes widening in shock. I squeezed, my grip tightening with every pulse of anger and fear surging through me. Her hands clawed at my wrists, but I didn't let go. I couldn't. Her face reddened, then darkened, her eyes pleading as her nails dug into my skin, drawing blood. But her strength faded quickly. Her struggling weakened, until finally, her hands fell limp at her sides and her body sagged. As her final breath escaped, her phone slipped from her hand and fell to the forest floor with a soft thud. The realization of what I'd just done hit me like a sledgehammer, and I stumbled back, staring down at her lifeless body in numb horror. Sheila, the only person who'd shown me care, was gone by my own hands. With trembling fingers, I picked up her phone, staring at it like it held a curse. My breaths came in shallow gasps as the horror of my actions set in. Sheila's body, the stillness of her chest, the unnatural angle of her neck. I finally broke down, tears blurring my vision as the weight of what I'd done crushed me. I dialed 911, barely able to form the words when the operator answered.
Upon his arrest, Daniel Carter handed over Sheila's phone to the police, but when the officers reviewed the footage, however, the reality was far from what Daniel claimed. Instead of violent acts or bloody confrontations, the videos revealed a disoriented Daniel wandering through various locations in a daze. He moved in a trance-like state, often stopping to mark certain spots with a crude symbol before continuing on his aimless path. There was no bloodshed, no horror, only the strange ritual of his sleepwalking. The officers' confusion deepened, yet their investigation continued. They followed the trail of the marked locations, only to discover a chilling truth. At each of the 5 sites Daniel had visited, the authorities unearthed a body, each one shockingly preserved but unmistakably long deceased. These were not recent murders, but rather victims who had vanished years prior, their fates long buried in the town's forgotten past. Further investigation led them to a name that sent shivers through the lead detective: Matthew Carter, Daniel's grandfather. Daniel Carter was charged with the first-degree murder of Sheila Raines, but due to the peculiar nature of the entire case, the defense pleaded insanity. Daniel insisted hysterically that he had committed his grandfather's murders himself. Hearing that his grandfather had been a ruthless killer further deteriorated Daniel's mind, leading the judges and the jury to conclude that he had truly lost his grip on reality by the end of the court proceedings. On April 4, 2011, Daniel Carter was declared clinically insane and confined to an undisclosed mental hospital where he was to undergo treatment, if treatment was possible. Should he recover, he was sentenced to serve 20 years in prison. For more horror scary stories, please subscribe.